Penn State football has a little more clarity on the offensive line coming out of the beginning of the week, where there was a big win for the Nittany Lions. Penn State's offensive line coach Phil Trautwein has been on a roll, getting commits from the class of 2022 all the way to 2024. But the ones that matter and the ones that we're going to focus on today are the ones that are coming into Penn State for next season. Hunter Nourzad joined the program earlier this week. So with that, a more clear picture, we are updating our opinions about what Penn State could be in 2022. Dave Eckert joins me. We're going to do something new today. Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, T. Frank. I'm a little tired, but we're gonna roll through it. I'm excited to talk about some offensive line stuff.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about the O-line first, but we're gonna get to the reason you're tired at the end of the show, talking about basketball, recap of last night's loss to Michigan. That's all coming up in just a little bit. But I don't want to say we're going full Stephen A. Smith today, but you and I are gonna have a healthy debate, taking one side versus the other, about whether Penn State is going to be better on the offensive line next season. As the guest, I gave you first choice. This is basically overtime rules, except instead of flipping a coin, I just gave it to you. So you are picking which side of our argument today.
I will try to insert the word blasphemous into every sentence that I say today. But
I'm going are wrong! Sorry, I had to cut you off once in a bombastic way. Okay. So go ahead. You are picking which side?
I'm going better, T. Frank. I know. Optimism around the Penn State offensive line. How dare I?
Yes.
But yeah, I'll go better.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll see where it takes us.
We'll see where it takes us. So let's just set the scene so you get an idea of what we're working with today. So Penn State offensive line returning two players from 2022, presumably in the starting role is what we're going to say right now, with Caden Wallace and Juice Scruggs. There are 5 new additions this offseason, 3 that are freshmen in the class of 2022, Drew Shelton, Malik McNeil, and Vega Ioane. 1 JUCO transfer, or recruit if you want to put it that way, in JB Nelson, and so far 1 transfer in Cornell's Hunter Nourzad. So those are the 5 players, adding to what Penn State already had on the roster, with a couple other notable players, Landon Tangwall and Olufashanu, getting starts or significant playing time at the very least in the bowl game. So that's what we're working with today. And again, as the guest, I will allow you to go first. So please state your case as to why Penn State will be better on the offensive line in 2022.
Here's the thing, T. Frank, and I'll put this all out there right at the very beginning. The entire basis of my choice and the ensuing argument is going to be that I don't think they could possibly be worse. I just don't. You look at what they're losing, and in my head, Rasheed Walker is a guy who has some NFL upside and who scouts like, but of the 3 starters that they're losing, was anybody really, really like a difference maker? Was there anybody who you circle and say they're really going to miss his contributions from last season? I don't think so. So when you add a Hunter Nourzad, when you add another year of developments for those 2 young guys that you mentioned, maybe JB Nelson, that JUCO transfer, can help you. He's the top overall JUCO recruit according to the On3 rankings. So, they're bringing in some guys who might be able to make an impact soon. So yeah, I have a hard time believing that they're going to repeat that level of just total dysfunction.
Oh, Dave. Dave. How I led the lamb to the slaughter here. You're going to have to bring it a little harder if you want to debate with me. First off, let's talk about what you just said. Penn State's offensive line could not be worse. Check out Colorado from 2021. Watch their offensive line. It is one of the worst I've ever seen when I was doing some work on them this year. So, that being said, it could get worse, but I don't think that's the case here. I think, Dave, that it's going to be about the same. And here is the thing when it comes to Penn State's starting returning offensive lineman, Juice Scruggs. He is the second most veteran player, as you mentioned, coming back as far as guys that they're losing. Rasheed Walker, Mike Miranda, Eric Wilson. Juice Scruggs has, let me look this up so I get the exact number, 1,096 career snaps. 900 of those came last season. Caden Wallace. Remember last year when we had this conversation about Caden Wallace of, yeah, he looked great in a small sample size in 2020 when they didn't throw the football. And everyone was excited about his promise and his recruitment and everything, and he plays right tackle. He has the most returning snaps on the offensive line with 1,286. So Penn State is not bringing back a lot of veteran experience on the offensive line, even with that. And their most veteran player last season gave up 35 pressures and 5 sacks, according to PFF. So there is no tackle depth at the moment in competition with Caden Wallace. That guy's going to slot in at right tackle. Juice Scruggs, seems pretty clear, is moving over to center. Outside of that, we've got 2 freshmen. Left tackle, Olafashanu. He looked fine. He looked good. But I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste my arguments about Scruggs and Wallace from last year and say, you can look good in a small sample size. Landon Tangwall looked good in a small sample size as a true freshman. We don't know what he looks like against Ohio State. We just didn't see that. There's a reason we didn't see that. So what are you getting out of those 2 guys? And then the last thing I'll say, and this is something that I brought up in my article today, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it. You need to read this article so you can find the answers. You don't have to come you don't have to come to a shill like Dave. I always point the wrong way. Who doesn't know what he's talking about. BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Potential lineups for next season. One of the things I point out is that Hunter Norzad comes in, and I've done some film study on him. I've talked about him on this channel, saying he's a good prospect. 6'4", 300 pounds. Lining up next to Juice Scruggs, 6'3", 307 pounds. One of Penn State's biggest problems last season was that from guard to guard, they lacked size, strength, and the ability to move people. So if those 2, even if you're a better, more tenacious, more physical run blocker, if you don't have the sand in your pants to do it, that's the biggest question coming into next season. It is not a guarantee. So that means you've got a freshman, and then those 2, and then before you get to Tangwall, who is probably the strongest, most physical guy in the projected lineup. You might get more of the same next year. You might not be worse, but you might not be any better. So that's why I think that it's going to be the same in 2022 as it was in 2021. Your thoughts?
I want to state for the record that the same was not presented to me as an option before we started doing this. So
I'll say it's worse then. Fine. It's worse. Okay. I'll say that equals worse. That equals worse because it's same plus time equals worse. The lack of progression makes it worse.
Right. I think some of the guys who you're talking about there, your Tangwalls, your Fashanus, right? I understand the small sample size skepticism. Those are 3 hard words to say consecutively. But I guess where I'm looking at it is you expect those guys based on their pedigree, based on what we thought about them before they came to Penn State. You expected them to be good. Maybe not immediately, but you expected them to be good football players. So based on that baseline, I guess I expect them to be pretty good football players next season. Am I informed a little bit by what we saw this year? Yeah, but I have a hard time, I guess, just taking the pessimistic view of that because it's not like Landon Tangwall is some, low 3-star guy who Penn State took a chance on. Landon Tangwall was one of the best offensive linemen in his cycle. So I think there will be improvement there. I think there will be improvement with Olafashanu, who is another guy who is highly touted out of high school. I don't know a whole lot about Hunter Norzad, but, he was an FCS All-American. An FCS All-American, and I think, that's nothing to sneeze at, even if this this step up is going to be a lot. And then, JB Nelson again is a guy who the analysts are really high on. So I think Penn State has some ability here. It's just going to be a matter of making it count. And look, I still think that Phil Troutwine is a good offensive line coach. I know that's his work at Boston College was excellent. He's kind of been dealt a difficult hand here. I think that with the right pieces, Phil Troutwine will get the job done.
We're doing a terrible job with this. I'm just going to cut you off just because I need to cut you off at some point and say you're wrong. Okay, continue. Sorry, I was listening. I forgot. I'm not supposed to actually listen to you. So go ahead.
I was done. Yeah, exactly. You're just supposed to make really mean faces and then scream at random interjections. But
So I'm going to drop the act for a second and just agree with you on what your last point was, that generally I think that Phil Troutwine's gotten a bad rap so far from a tough situation and tough circumstances. But who are the guys that as you look at it, who do you think are the guys that are going to contribute next season? And do you think it's going to be 5 guys? Do you think it's going to be 6? How many players do you think Penn State can put on the field and maybe rotate at certain positions?
I'm concerned about the depth. You're looking at the 2 returning starters. You're looking at Fashanu. You're looking at Tengwall. You're looking at Nourzad, and you're looking at Nelson. And then I think you need growth from Jimmy Christ. Salim Wormley is another guy who I don't think we've talked about a lot. He was going to start. He was going to start this season, and then he got injured. So if he can come back and be a guy that Penn State can rely on, I think that's big, and that gives you 8. Am I counting right? I think that's 8. So would you like to have more? Yeah. Are you making some assumptions in I guess making that group of 8? Yeah. But I don't think there's an outlandish scenario where Penn State has a decent core of guys to call upon when they need it.
I think one of the things I want to highlight here is what we don't know, and not to beat the same drum, but what we don't know about Fashanu, because in every single combination, every single iteration of offensive lines that I've put together, there is one left tackle right now. There is Fashanu, and then you saw what Landon Tengwall did in some special circumstances in the flu game or in the snow against Michigan State and Rutgers in those games. So that is a certain sample size, and I always go back to the sample size, but he looked good in those games. Penn State, when they had the opportunity to, played him on the inside. So Bryce Effner, is he your other tackle option?
Yeah.
Fashanu is the guy. The way they talked about him last season, he was talked as the clear heir apparent to Rasheed Walker. How does he handle speed rushers? How does he handle an Aiden Hutchinson type? Because, newsflash, it's the Big Ten. You're going to face one of those guys in some form or fashion, whoever the next guy to step up in the Big Ten is at Ohio State, Michigan, whomever it is. Whether Purdue has a Karlaftis on their roster after he's moved on, I don't know, but there's going to be a talented guy he's going to have to face, and there's a wild variety of ways that could go. Liked what I saw from him initially, but there's no way that I can really say he's athletic enough to hold up at the point of attack, and I think until you have that answer, until we see spring ball, you can't project him being better than Rasheed Walker, which is an area that Penn State needs to get better. That was an area where they were not up to the standard of what you expected from that position last season. So, again, it might be the same, but is the same good enough when you go into a season where you just went 7-6? So there's a lot of problems that could crop up, and I feel like there's more questions than answers, even now that we have the players that are going to be playing. And then the next thing I would say is, does Caden Wallace get better? Does Caden Wallace have to... It's the same thing at right tackle. There are no obvious guys. You point Jimmy Christ. We haven't seen a lot from him in any sort of situation or circumstance outside of practice. So is there still depth in competition? Have they rebuilt competition at the tackle position? That's what makes players better.
Sorry, T. Frank. Do you think that and Nourzad can be a guy who provides them some flexibility to move things around if they want to? Because I know he played tackle almost exclusively at Cornell, and I think Penn State kind of thinks he's a guard. But do you see that being a guy that they can move around and maybe, I guess plug holes where they need holes plugged?
I think Tengwall's that guy, not Norzad.
Uh-huh.
And before we go any further, you vote in the comments who had the better argument. Was it Dave or was it me, T. Frank? So leave a comment to who you think won the argument, because I've exhausted all of my ability to argue, and I don't like being negative anyway. So I want to be done. It's my show. We're done. But to answer your question, I think Tengwall is that guy more so than Norzad. Norzad talked to Ryan Snyder earlier this week. Another reason to go check out Blue White Illustrated. Sign up for just $1. Get 12 months of access to exclusive On3 content at Blue White Illustrated. 12 months for $1. Sign up, get all that information, and hear what Hunter Norzad had to say to Ryan. But one of the things he mentioned was that he's coming here because he was playing out of position at Cornell. At the next level, he projects as a guard or a center. He did bring up center, and I don't think we're considering that part enough. I think he would be a good project at center, or a good positional fit at center as well, so he provides flexibility on the interior. But to me, it's Tengwall that can play all 5 positions. He would be the guy that would have to challenge somebody at one of those 2 tackle positions to give Penn State the flexibility to then make a change at what is kind of the guys that are inked in at their positions right now with not a ton of challenge behind them. It's one of the things we talked about in my article over at Blue White Illustrated, so you can check that out as well. But yeah, I think Tengwall's the guy.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just looking at the bio, and I thought it was interesting that Penn State has a completely different projection from him than where he was playing at Cornell.
Yeah,
but yeah, that seems logical.
I still think that, and not to beat on this enough, but Norzad to Iowa and what that kind, just the puzzle pieces and watching him play, I do think center is a possibility. But he's coming to Penn State. Let me just be painfully clear. Everything that we've heard, everything that we've talked about, and everything that the initial responses have all been, he's a guard. So he's gonna be in that competition. And it makes sense, again, going back to our conversation about veterans playing at certain positions. Juice Scruggs is one of the most veteran players on the team. He's going to be the first option to handle the center position. And he wasn't terrible there last season when he was put there in a pinch. In the middle of a game, he switched over to play center. So with a year of practice, he has the opportunity to take a step forward there. So yeah, make sure you comment in the video about who you think won our argument, and we'll do better next time. I think we need sound effects, Dave. I really think we need intense sound effects and maybe some angry bed music.
I am expecting Penn State fans to have just excessive amounts of positivity as it relates to their thoughts on the offensive line. So I'm sure I'm going to win here.
Especially in the comments. That's exactly where you find the positivity.
Yes.
Shout out to all of our commenters on our YouTube videos. Thank you for being a part of the show. So let's talk about basketball. Last night, Penn State was in another surprisingly close game. I know something you said earlier today is how can they find more ways to lose excruciatingly close games? So take us through what happened last night when Penn State lost to Michigan at home. 9 p.m. tip, Dave.
Gross. Just abysmal. So Penn State started well. They were making shots. They were getting really good looks. I think they were up 33 to I think it was 34 to 23 with about 4 minutes left in the first half. And then they didn't score for 10 minutes. So Michigan, by the end of that stretch, I think was up 4. Penn State kind of got its offense going, kind of didn't, and ended up losing a tough one, and one that I tend to think they probably had to have if we're going to keep up the discussion of, okay, there might be a postseason berth, whether it's, the NIT, probably the NIT, in this season for this team. Now I think some extraordinary things are going to happen for that to be realistic. But yeah, having a hard time scoring. Same thing happened against Wisconsin. They scored 3 points in 12 minutes. So they're having some challenges.
When it comes to these collapses, and there was a mini collapse against Iowa that let them back into the game,
Mhm.
that forced double overtime, and you just mentioned one here against Michigan. Is it just the offense, or is it something more? Is there a more out of sync sort of situation where they're struggling to get offense and defense and the whole thing to work together, or is it simply just they go down, they clang too many off the basket, and then the other team scores?
I think against Michigan specifically, Penn State has a depth problem, and one thing that we should probably touch on is Greg Lee's injured again, and he's kind of one of their very important secondary scorers, and he had a boot on, so we don't know what that means for his future. But Penn State and Micah Shrewsbury actually said, kind of around that 4 minute mark in the first half where they stopped scoring and Michigan made a run, they were exhausted. Like all of their starters, all of their key players were tired and asking to come out of the game. And, Shrewsbury went with an alternative lineup with including some players who probably are not at Big Ten standard. Um, and, Michigan made a run. I think there's a little bit of that. When John Harrah goes to the bench, Penn State's offense has a really difficult time just executing because Penn
Why
State's
why
offense
is
is,
that? What is
yeah,
it about his presence that allows them to execute?
Penn State's offense is very pick and roll heavy. If
Mm-hmm.
you watch their just their action, you'll see almost every possession begins with a John Harrah screen at the top of the key. And they base almost everything off of that. And John Harrah is a rock. He's a brick wall. That screen is not as good when John Harrah isn't in the game.
Right.
And he's an orchestrator too. John Harrah is a very good passer. He makes smart decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Even if he's not the guy who's scoring the ball, which a lot of times he isn't, I think he's just a really important fixture and decision maker for them on offense. And when he's not there, I think they suffer. So, and he's a big man. Big men can't play 40 minutes. John Harrah plays like in the 20s somewhere. So Penn State has to deal with extended periods of maybe their pin on offense off the floor every
Mm-hmm.
game. And look, they have problems sometimes with him on the floor, definitely.
Yeah.
But I think in this game specifically, the struggles started when they didn't have their guys out there.
So what do they lose when he's not on the floor and you don't have Greg Lee to go to? So what do they lose with Lee not there, and then with both
Yeah,
of them not there? What's the vacuum?
there's a huge vacuum because a lot of times they'll play them both at the same time, and that with both of them on the floor, I think Penn State is a team that out rebounds its opponent, and with one of them on the floor, Penn State gets out rebounded, and we saw that last night. Hunter Dickinson, one of the best centers in the country. I think he's like 7'1", 7'2", just like vacuuming in offensive rebounds. I think Michigan had like 19 second chance points. So without the ability to have that added size on the floor, Penn State has a problem. And look, Jelani White is a guy they got from Canisius. He's he didn't play a ton there last season. I think they've been pleasantly surprised with what they've gotten out of him, but he's not. This I think might be a step too far for Jelani White. So asking him to come in and be Greg Lee is not realistic.
Right.
We saw Giovanni Scott, another transfer, kind of come in and he was energetic, but I think made some bad decisions, kind of went too fast. So they really just don't have another option there that gives them the same thing.
I mean, to underscore your point, 19 second chance points for Michigan, a big swing in the game. Now, Penn State did get 26 points in the paint, thanks to Sam Sessoms and some of the things you've talked about, but those second chance points, Penn State was getting a lot of those with Lee and with Harrah on the court together. So that void is going to be something they got to work through for the rest, or for a significant period of time. It seems, as you mentioned, Greg Lee showing a picture of himself in a walking boot earlier this week. So, what's coming up next for Penn State basketball?
Yeah, they've got Minnesota this weekend. Um, they're on the road. That's a difficult place to play, but I think that's a beatable team. So, it feels like, again, I thought this one was one that they had to have. they really need this game. They need to get a win on the road. They need to find a way, and it's not going to be easy without Greg Lee. And they were already a team that didn't have the same kind of depth as the teams that they're playing not week in and week out, and now they have less depth. And you're later on the season, and guys are tired. It's going to be tough.
Yeah.
You're asking a lot of them at this point.
How
So
do
we'll
they
see what they can
avoid?
do.
How do they avoid that end of the season slide then? Because that's kind of what it sounds like you're setting up for. Is they're tired, they're losing players, they don't have depth anyway. How do they avoid that in this situation?
They start making shots. Because look, I mean, T. Frank, they're holding teams full of future NBA players. So it's a 50 to 58 points,
Yeah.
and they're defending, so well. And it's just, that's, I think, what's frustrating for Penn State fans, because look, if you lose 75 to 55, like, okay, you knew that you lost that game by halftime.
Yeah.
But they're in these games because they're so stout defensively, and they just need to make shots to complement that. Because I think if there's one area of their game where maybe you start to see fatigue set in, and you start to see it taper off a little bit, it might be that defense, right? How long can they conceivably, without their depth, playing every 3 days, keep these teams loaded with weapons under 60 points?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Playing
So
with that
they've gotta
energy and that
figure it out.
effort on every play takes it out of you.
Yeah, it's tough. So they've got to score. They got to score points.
Well,
They gotta
Dave,
find a way.
this is fun. Thanks for coming on, giving us the information about the offensive line, about I still think John Harrar could play on the offensive line, so we're even talking about the offensive line there with Penn State basketball. Thanks for coming on the show today.
You got it, T. Frank. Thanks for having me.